welcome, welcome, welcome. So sorry we're starting a little bit late, but we're trying to make sure that people who are still parking could come in and not miss any part of this, what is going to be a really, really good conversation. But we are going to get started now. There are just a few ground rules. Please put your phone on Do Not Disturb or silent if it's with you. You don't have to turn it off, but just we don't want to interrupt our panelists. They have some amazing things to say. Also, please do not Instagram live us, Facebook live us. There is an official videographer and photographer in the back. The full video will be available on the department website, so if you miss any part of it, you can always go back and watch. And you'll have a question and answer session as soon as our panelists are done. And enjoy. Are we feeling good? Yeah. Yes, I like your energy. Okay, so welcome to the first Black Women Writing Black Histories panelist discussion. The first of what I hope will be many. My name is Lacey Hunter. I'll fully introduce myself later, but I'm going to introduce you to our panelists, reading their bios. First is Dr. Melissa Cooper. She's a writer, historian, professor. She holds a BS in secondary education from Temple University and a master's in history from Rutgers, Newark. She holds a PhD from Rutgers in New Brunswick. She is the author of the groundbreaking historical study, Making Gullah, A History of Sapelo Islanders, Race and the American Imagination. I think many of these books are out in the hallway, so you can definitely check them out. Don't feel pressured to write down the titles right now. Let's see, where am I? Making Gullah has captured the attention of general reading audiences, students, and scholars. Dr. Cooper's book was reviewed in The New Yorker and was featured in Upscale magazine in June 2017. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Making Gullah continues to attract popular audiences. Dr. Cooper delivered a lecture on the book at the 2017 Decatur Book Festival, one of the largest, bless you, independent book festivals in the United States. She has been featured on several podcasts and radio shows where she's talked about Making Gullah and American history, a list that includes NPR's Two-Way Street. She is also the author of Selling Voodoo in Migration Metropolises in Race and Retail, and Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans with Documents, the Instructor's Resource Manual. Dr. Cooper has authored blog posts, and she has written an op-ed for NBC News. Her teaching experience spans nearly 2 decades, and she is currently an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University, Newark, and has been a member of the faculty at the University of South Carolina and Columbia University. Then there is Dr. Cheryl Hicks. She's an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She holds a bachelor's in American history from the University of Virginia and a PhD in American history from Princeton University. Her research addresses the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, and the law. She has published articles in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review and the Journal of History of Sexuality. Her first book, Talk With You Like a Woman, African American Women, Justice, and Reform in New York, 1890 to 1935, published by North Carolina Press, received the 2001 Letitia Woods Brown Book Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. Her current project, Black Enchantress, Hannah Elias, Interracial Sex, Murder and Civil Rights in Jim Crow New York, explores the shifting meanings of interracial sex, racial segregation, criminality, and Black civil rights struggles in the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era America. She is the recipient of a 2017-2018 Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship in African American History at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Dr. Keisha Khan Perry is currently an associate professor of Africana Studies at Brown University, where she specializes in race, gender, and politics in the Americas, urban geography, and questions of citizenship, intellectual history, and disciplinary formation, and the interrelationship between scholarship, pedagogy, and political engagement. Her most recent work, Black Women Against the Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil, is an ethnographic study of Black women's activism in Brazilian cities. specifically an examination of Black women's participation and leadership in neighborhood associations and the reinterpretations of racial and gender identities in urban spaces. It was a winner of the National Women's Studies Association 2014 Gloria E. Anzaldúa Book Award. This book includes analysis of the relationship between environmental justice movements and land and housing rights struggles in the northeastern Brazilian city of Salvador. This year, as a faculty fellow at the Brown University Pembroke Center for Research and Teaching on Women, she is completing the research for her next book project, Evictions and Convictions, the Gendered Racial Logic of Black Dispossessions in New York City. Dr. Robin Spencer is a historian that focuses on Black social protests after World War II, urban and working class radicalism and gender. She teaches survey and seminar courses on Black history at Lehman College, City University of New York. Her first book, The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland, on gender and the organizational evolution of the Black Panther Party, was a finalist for Benjamin Hooks Institute National Book Award, sponsored by the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change at the University of Memphis, and it received honorable mention for the Letitia Woods Brown Book Prize, sponsored by the Association of Black Women's Historians. Her writings on the Black Panther Party have appeared in the Journal of Women's History, Souls, Radical Teacher, and several collections of essays on the 1960s. In 2016, she received the Mellon Fellowship at Yale University to work on her second book project, To Build the World Anew, the Black liberation politics in the movement against the Vietnam War. This project examines how working class African Americans, anti-imperialist consciousness in the 1950s, from the 1950s to the 1970s, shaped their engagement with movement against the Vietnam War. In many ways, it continues her emphasis on exploring overlapping and intersecting boundaries between social protest movements. She is also working on a short biography of Angela Davis for Westview Press, Lives of American Women series. Dr. Deborah Gray White is the Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, in New Jersey. She is the author of the seminal Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South, Too Heavy a Load, Black Women in Defense of Themselves, 1894 to 1994, several K-12 textbooks on United States history, and Let My People Go, African Americans, 1804 to 1860. In 2008, she published and edited a work entitled Telling Histories, Black Women in the Ivory Tower, a collection of personal narratives written by African American women historians that chronicle the entry of Black women into the historical profession and the development of the field of Black women's history. Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans, a co-authored college text, is now in its second edition as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and as a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow. White conducted research on her newest book, Lost in the USA, American Identity from the Promise Keepers to the Million Mom March. She was recently awarded the Carter G. Woodson Medallion for Excellence in African American History, and also received an honorary doctorate from her undergraduate alma mater, Binghamton University. She currently heads the Scarlet and Black Project, which investigates Native Americans and African Americans in the history of Rutgers University. With Professor Marissa Fuentes, she is editor of the 2016 volume Scarlet and Black, Slavery and the Dispossession in Rutgers History. And finally, there is me, Lacey Hunter. I am the junior minted PhD, so these ladies are my heroes. If I get teary-eyed or starry-eyed, it's because I'm in awe. So don't mind me. I also laugh. I also cry when I laugh, so don't panic if I laugh myself to tears. I am a recent historian whose research is the intersection of citizenship, spirituality, and gender for African American women in the 19th and 20th centuries. I am hoping to publish my dissertation. It's called Made in His Image, The Origins of African American Women's Jeremiad. I also teach the Intro to AfAm Studies courses here in the African American Studies Department, African American and African Studies Department. I teach a course on the history of hip hop, take it if you're into hip hop. And I'm currently teaching a course on interdisciplinary research methods. Okay, so now you've got their backstories, We have such an amazing conversation coming for you. Ladies, did it take forever? Hopefully not. Hopefully I'm okay. All right. Okay. So The first question is to tell us about the first history book that you all wrote, and what inspired the book that you published.
We're pretending to be shy.
Okay, well, I will go first. The first history book that I published is my recently published book, The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland. It was inspired by many things. I started to think about the book when I was an undergraduate student. I took a wonderful course on women and social movements, and I read Assata Shakur's autobiography, and it really changed my life. It was such a great read. It really brought me into just thinking about memoir and the politics of memory and the continuing struggle. It really did sort of change the path of my life. I continued to read autobiographies from that period, and I came to the end of that struggle, and there was nothing else to read. And I wanted to think about ways that I could contribute literature that would be available for people who wanted to learn more than the individual stories, but thinking about the larger tapestry of the past, and especially how we can think about women as Black power advocates, as leaders, think about recovering their voices, their actions, and making them more visible in the historical narrative. So that's my book, and that's why I wrote it.
Dr. Cooper?
Well, my first book, which just came out in April, Making Gullah, History of Sapelo Islanders, Race and the American Imagination, it sort of started in part as a genealogy sort of project. I have family connections to Sapelo Island. My maternal lineage is from the island. And as I searched and sort of investigated the history of Black Sapelo Islanders, I was struck by the fact that I discovered them in lots of published works that were conceived and researched during the 20s and 30s. And these works over and over again sort of paired their folk culture with their African culture, looking for African retentions. And that struck me. And what struck me was not necessarily the idea, the possibility that African culture had survived in the Americas, but what struck me was when these questions were being asked about Blacks' hereditary, right? So when Sapelo Islanders really started to attract the attention of researchers and writers in the nation, Jim Crow was complete. The Blacks who lived on the island, the people who had, at this island that had once been sort of a haven for newly freed men and freed women during the Civil War, had been sort of returned to a plantation state. And Black people's connection to Africa was presented as the assumed root of their alleged inferiority. And it would just seem like this was such an odd moment to sort of raise questions about the connection between these people, their African background, and sort of elevate their heritage to something worthy of being researched. So I knew that there was a bigger story there, and I wanted to get at that story, and wound up sort of taking me through the 20s and 30s, looking at ideas about Africa and Black people and race and heredity from inside of the academy, outside of the academy, popular culture, through the Gullah revival. It took me a lot of places and far away from Sapelo. But ultimately, what I did with the book was I turned the observational lens from the Low Country Blacks and instead turned it on the researchers and writers who had been collecting them. So I was collecting the collectors. And in the end, I think what I learned told me more about race in America and the American imagination than it did about a folk culture in the Low Country. So that was the work.
Dr. West?
Long time ago. When I started writing Aren't I a Woman, it was actually my PhD dissertation, and I wrote it because it was during a time when there were no histories on African Americans, period. At least not like what you have today. A lot of books had begun to come out on slavery. And I mean, big books written by some of the big white men of the profession. And as I read them, I said to, I kept looking for myself, or looking for my history, looking for African American women in the sources. When I say big books, Roll, Jordan, Roll, Time on the Cross, Black Family and Slavery and Freedom, and there was something very disquieting about what I was reading, because a lot of them were writing in reference or in response to the Moynihan Report that had come out in the middle 60s, and another book by Stanley Elkins that had called all black men Sambos. And as much as I thought that they were doing a sort of a repairing job and they were doing some corrective work, I just kept looking for the women. And they kept talking about the men, and the men this, and the men that. And as I sat in my graduate class, the only woman, the only black, I'm like, y'all really just, you only got half the story. And as a result, I set to work writing, what became Aren't I a Woman?
Dr. Hicks?
I'm actually going to take this a little differently. This is about my book, but the first published piece that I did on Black history was actually an article. It's called In Danger of Becoming Morally Depraved, Single Black Women, Working Class Black Families, and the New York Wayward Minor Laws. And I wrote that article when I was an assistant professor, but it was very much a part of the ideas that helped to form the book. It focused on working class families and their communities and how they use the state to help protect their female relatives, but also to not just protect them, but also control their behavior. And so using the state, they believed that these laws were going to actually help them. And I was inspired by three things in terms of writing that piece. One were practitioners. So I'm a graduate student who has rose-colored lenses looking at the state, particularly the criminal justice system and these young women. And I gave a talk at John Jay School of Criminal Justice. And so I'm telling them these stories about the criminal justice system and these black families, and these probation officers and parole officers and social workers, they said, well, hold up. You need to really broaden the scope of what you're doing, because you've not asked the question of what if these families actually go to the state to help them with their children. And so I hadn't really thought about that, but they opened up a space for me to think about conflict within families and how we might think about what that means. The second inspiration for that article and for the work overall was for me as a historian to go to an academic conference where historians and lawyers were talking about social history or talking about legal history. And I'd always wanted to be a lawyer when I was an undergraduate. And so I thought that that was actually what that was my goal. I came to college and I was going to be a lawyer. And here was this moment where I was at a law school talking to lawyers about my work as a historian and realizing that I was actually doing legal history on black people and talking about a system that had problems, but also talking about the complexity of black people's lives, working class and working for black people's lives. And the third inspiration came from being an undergraduate who was inspired to be a historian based on my work and research on activist Ella Baker. Ella Baker was a civil rights activist who believed in the extraordinary possibilities of everyday working class and working poor people. And so I used that commitment that I found as an undergraduate in my work to really focus on the resilience, the flaws, the strengths, and the joys of working class and working poor Black people and Black families, and particularly Black women. And so my inspiration came from some wake-up calls, some moments where I actually was able to fulfill some dreams that I didn't actually know that I could, but also the research that I did as an undergraduate very much shaped the ways in which I was able to focus on the work that I'm doing, that I did with the first book, the first article, and that the ideas that I have now.
I have to begin with a confession. I'm a trained anthropologist. I consider myself now an ethno-historian more so. So I'm an anthropologist who loves to read and write history, but I wasn't trained as a historian. Dr. Cooper told me not to tell anyone that I actually lived in Newark and graduated from Newark Science High.
We both did.
Yes.
We go way back.
I lived on Bleecker Street. When Bleecker Street, I think it still used to be part of Rutgers housing. So I would say that my first book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, the fight for racial justice in Brazil, actually began right here in Newark. And actually, I should say before that, with my own displacement as an immigrant to the United States, and then a series of struggles that my mom faced with homelessness in this country, including being kicked out of Rutgers housing because I had turned 18 while in college. And she fought Rutgers so that we could stay in the housing on Bleecker Street, but I eventually lost that battle. So we were always very interested in questions around homelessness, questions around housing rights, and I should mention that heterosexual couples could actually live in Rutgers housing, but a young mom with her child could not live in Rutgers housing, even though that was her primary, the place where she lived. So that said, I became very interested in questions around housing rights as a teenager. I mobilized with housing rights activists in Washington, D.C. while in undergrad. And when I was about to graduate from college, I thought that I would come back to Newark and participate somehow in the underground, kind of the grassroots struggles against gentrification in Newark. Accidentally, I meet a historian by the name of Elisete da Silva, who invited me to stay with her in Brazil. She said, well, if you decide to come back to Brazil, I had studied abroad in Argentina and Brazil while in undergrad, and she said, if you decide to come back, you can stay with my family. And I said, okay, I'm going to do that. So her husband was also a labor historian, and they allowed me to stay with them until I could find and secure permanent housing in Brazil after I graduated from college. So that's how I got introduced in terms of more on a long-term basis to kind of live in Brazil for the year, work with activists. They were very much politically engaged. I took courses at the university, and I was introduced to grassroots activists that were fighting around housing and land rights. And I realized at that time, when Frances Windance Twine had written a book criticizing blacks in Brazil for buying into white supremacy and not being very active. And Michael Hanchard, a political scientist, had written a book saying that there were no real kind of mass movements in Brazil to fight white supremacy, and that, in essence, blacks only organize around cultural politics. My argument with that book was to suggest that he hadn't looked at the everyday grassroots neighborhood movements led by poor black women focused on issues of everyday survival, such as housing, police abolition, fighting against rapid urban development. I'd already had a lexicon of gentrification from living in Newark, so it allowed me to understand better what was going on in a place like Salvador. And that's how I became inspired to write the book, but primarily I wanted to focus on black women. I wanted to focus on poor black women primarily who were uneducated and tell their stories. Atypical of anthropologists, I decided to use their real names because I wanted their names to be written down in history. I wanted them to be remembered as the Ana Cristina da Silva Caminhas, as the Rita Barbosas, so that they wouldn't be forgotten. And the struggle continues to this day. And I can talk more as I respond about how my work has evolved. But certainly, I was very much committed to writing the histories of working class women and their political ideas and actions.
I want to ask a slightly deeper question. How many people in the room study Black history? Yes, I presume you would, because you're here. I often find that, studying and researching and writing Black history, especially Black women's history, that there are almost as many tragedies as there are triumphs, right? That every time the women that I study seem to overcome something, accomplish something. I mean, they're almost wrapped up in these moments of sorrow, or wrapped up in, other challenges that are connected to the victories that they've achieved. And I'm wondering if you guys can each sort of talk about how you deal with that complexity in the work that you do personally and as scholars. And Ben, if you like.
I'm going to break out of this sequence. I am going to answer this question. But I think we should just organically move into the questions that move us. I mean, I write about the history of political resistance. I write about people who took the challenges that they faced, whether it be unequal education, the rampages of police brutality, the housing shortages, the very real post-World War II structural inequalities that position African American people oftentimes at the bottom of the economy, and took those circumstances and used it as tools for their liberation. So I get very excited about the people that I write about, because to me they challenge the odds. They are heroes in the fact that they moved from inaction oftentimes to action, right? And that they created a political vision for themselves and moved to enact it. So when I think about working on those kinds of individuals and those kinds of organizations, it is very inspirational, right? Because I write about people in the Black Panther Party who got up very early in the morning and at great personal sacrifice worked for the people, like literally from sun up to sundown. They gave up their autonomy. They let other people decide what they would do for the day. They even gave up their material possessions and committed to collective ways of living and being. So in a lot of ways, there's a lot to learn about the potential in that history. At the same time, I write about the struggles that they face as they try to make that revolution happen. Some of those struggles came from political repression from external to the organization. So I'm talking about the role of the FBI in politically repressing the Black Panther Party, in surveilling the organization, infiltrating, etc. But I also talk about the internal contradictions within the organization as well. The ways in which their political ideology manifested weaknesses that were corrosive to the well-being of the organization. The way in which they dealt with things like women in power, sexism, homophobia, etc. The ways in which they dealt with classism within their organization. And also, just sometimes the way in which disempowered people, when they get power, oftentimes turn into tyrants. And I think dealing with that sort of very real human interiority of a movement is also very heartbreaking, because you get a chance to see that potential and try to understand why that potential was not realized, and sometimes it's not the answer that we want or that we would expect that allows us to understand why they not able to achieve their goals as an organization. So those are the challenges, I think, of writing about Black political resistance, Black radicalism, is also to think about not just the potential and the language and the legacy, but the challenges And I say that even though it sounds intuitive because I feel like in so many ways we're still there in that moment. We want to know all the fantastic things about the Malcolm X's of the world. We don't want to hear so much about critical perspectives, mistakes, things that we can learn about to move the liberation movement forward today. So I think in a lot of ways, balancing that, has been a challenge for me as I have walked through sort of focusing on this history of a particular organization. And, it's been quite interesting because sometimes people will say, well, your book is very balanced. And I never know exactly what that is supposed to mean, like they didn't expect anything to be critical in there or whatever narrative that they're trying to put on this story. I know that for the future, what we do need is a critical perspective on our past, and there's just no other alternative. So I think that in some ways being a historian requires that kind of courage, to tell those uncomfortable truths, to expose those imperfections, even as you understand that you're saying it in a context where there's a whole society that might want to amplify those negativities, but still they need to be said.
Dr. Wright?
Well, most of my work, although not all, is about African American women. And we used to say, well, black women suffer from both sexism as well as racism. Trying to unearth the history of African American women is exceptionally challenging because black women don't leave records. And particularly if you're looking in the 19th century, oftentimes what you have to do is get black women's history as they come through other people's sources, what people write about them as opposed to what African American women have written about themselves. And then when you do get some of the records, black women are very, very careful, and rightfully so, because we have been so slandered throughout history. On the one hand, we've been talked about as Jezebels, on the other hand, we've been everybody's mammy. And so rather than be truthful and let it all hang out, black women are very, very good at dissembling. And so even when you look at sources, even when you look at some diaries, you find this rare diary, and you will find black women dissembling to themselves in their own diaries. So it begins to be, it's very hard to really unearth that interiority. And then the other issue is that black women do suffer from racism and from sexism. And particularly since my first book was on female slaves, I just found it too difficult to live my life as a black woman, and then also to research black women, and then to teach black women. It all got to be too redundant. You talk about black women in the criminal justice system, or you talk about the way black women are treated by the police, the way black women are treated by the courts, and whenever you find yourself in a situation that sometimes you are really writing about, it's like, wait a minute, this is really real. This isn't just something that is esoteric. It's not just something you put in a history book. This is something I'm living from 9 to 5 on a daily basis. One of the ways that I started to deal with it was for a very long time, I did not teach African American history because I just could not live my life and at the same time go and teach it and research it and write it all at the same time. It's just, I could not, I needed some boundaries. So, I could tell you all kinds of other stories, but really one of the issues that I deal with in dealing with African American women is black women are just very good at hiding our true selves because so often that true self is taken and twisted, and people do mean things to us when they know who we really are. But for somebody who is going to try to find your history, in 50 years, in 100 years, because you're protecting yourself, you don't leave them the kind of records that they need to really tell you a true story.
Dr. Perry, I think you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, you know, I just was thinking a lot about this question. How do we sort of deal with this dichotomy, maybe the poles of tragedy and triumph? And in my last big research project, you know, I was actually introducing the concept of tragedy and triumph to a story that people had already assumed was quaint and beautiful and romantic. You know, you go to Charleston, you go to Savannah, you go to Hilton Head, and the Gullah, it's sweet grass and palmetto baskets, it's a nice dialect, it's everything is wonderful, and some red rice, and this is great, and what could possibly be wrong underneath the romantic canopy of Spanish moss dripping off of live oaks? And so some readers were disturbed to find that in the midst of that paradise, I found all this tragedy and triumph, this constant fight for freedom from the antebellum period through the Civil War, and every time gains were made, you know, here come the losses. And I wish I could say that I was able to end the book in a place where the islanders and other low country blacks were actually on the verge of another great moment of triumph, but it actually looks a different sort of way. So it's something that, you know that I struggled with in research. And then as an intellectual and cultural historian, sometimes I even struggle with the idea that we kind of break Black history up into these two poles. You know, it's either uplifting or heartbreaking. I'm always looking for what's complicated in between. And I wonder, when we do that, like these uplift stories and heartbreak stories, it's really positioning white supremacy at the center of the way that we understand the Black past. And I don't know if we can, especially as a historian of American history, right, if we can untangle it. But thinking about that question, I think, is a worthy intellectual exercise. Like, how much of our narrative around heartbreak and uplift or tragedy and triumph is centering white supremacy in a way that might distort the quote-unquote Black story, if we could even get at one outside of that context. So those are just some of the things I was thinking about in reference to your question.
I think for me, I wanted to know what the voices of working class Black women were. And they don't leave records in archives in the ways that folks who are very kind of attentive to what their legacy will be. And what I found really interesting was that I found the humanity of many of these women and their families in these criminal records. In part because at the time that I'm looking at these records, there is a professionalization of social work. And so they're writing all of these, they have all these questions, and they're asking these women all of these questions, but they're also asking people in their neighborhood questions about who these women were. And so I was able to pull together the stories of women that would not have been, that I wouldn't have known about, and people who read my work wouldn't know about, because you wouldn't necessarily think about finding the humanity of Black people in criminal records that are geared toward pathologizing them, right? But the title of my book, Talk With You Like a Woman, comes from a woman who was on parole, and she was living with her family, and she wasn't getting along with her family. And so the prison administrators basically went to her family members to see if she was doing what she was supposed to do, if she was behaving correctly. And she wrote them several letters and said, I made a mistake, I own up to that, but I'm a woman. Talk with me like a woman. Don't talk to my family. They don't own me. I did everything. I served my time. And to me, those words, those letters, were really important in terms of helping me understand that no one had to speak for working class Black people. They could speak for themselves, and I could find them in those records. And there were just things that I, this particular woman, and there were other women as well who had been paroled to family members, and they just didn't get along. And when I first read a letter by a woman who wrote back to the institution and said, "Listen, I'll come back to the prison. I can't. It's not working with the family." And I was like, really? But what that did was tell me about real conflict. Like, Black families have real conflict. And it doesn't mean that they're different from any other type of family, but I could actually glean that from those records. And it was something that the people who put those records together, they didn't expect that. But I found this humanity. I found these women. There was one woman who wrote a letter and said, "Yeah, I was arrested, but I do know that I really need to avoid my ABC." And her ABC was avoid bad company. So there's a way in which working class Black people in the scholarship and really generally are seen as someone has to teach them to be respectable. Somebody has to teach them to be moral. And what I found from those records is that no one had to teach them anything. We had to learn the concept of working class respectability in and of itself. And so that actually helped me understand the people that I was really interested in, and their voices taught me how to talk about them.
So we're gonna kind of double this question up for you, because I'd like you to take the lead on the next question, which is for everyone to really talk a little bit about how you do your research process. Like, how do you go through the process of finding the people that you're trying to tell stories about, or trying to help other people hear their stories, or to understand their experiences. And I know typically we talk in this country, of course, a lot about the African American experience, but Dr. Perry, you do more diasporic studies. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of talking about that also.
As I stated before, I always acknowledge the fact that my experience being Jamaican-born and African-American and growing up in the United States has certainly impacted how I experience even living in a place like Brazil. I think one of the experiences and part of being an ethnographer and interviewing and speaking with and participating in social movements over the years and documenting them, I think the greatest challenge that I've had to face and had to deal with, even in terms of how I write my book and my articles and so forth, is what I consider to be the reality and the pains of kind of Black death, right? And the everyday challenges of living in precarious situations. When I talk about the violence of gentrification, I credit a woman by the name of Iracy Isabel da Silva, also known as Dona Iracy, who was the first woman I interviewed. I was a graduate student. I had already met her while I was an activist, living in Brazil for the year. But I returned to kind of to interview her, to talk about her life, how she had come into activism. And she was the one that told me that I couldn't understand how gentrification takes place in cities like Brazil, in cities like Salvador, without thinking seriously about the importance of state violence, the importance of police abuse and police brutality, and everyday kind of violence in communities, right? So one of the first things that needs to happen is a certain kind of cleansing of particular elements. Black and brown communities become disposable, but primarily they have to prove to these newcomers that the neighborhoods are safe, right? So they have to kind of expel the unwanted folks from these spaces, and they kind of bear the brunt of this brutality on an everyday basis. So for them, as women activists, they couldn't only fight for land rights or housing rights. They also had to fight against a perception of Black life as being disposable, right? So I think that's important. But also just the everyday presence of the police force and militarized police force in neighborhoods, right? So how do you do research under those conditions? I wrote an article about what it was like to be in the middle of a police raid, sitting in someone's house. I'm an anthropologist from the United States, but I'm also an activist. I'm sitting in someone's house and there's a police raid. So what do I do in that moment? Do I pick up, how do you document that moment? How do you remember that moment? How do you tell that story, right? And how does that moment even impact how you interact with these people, how you tell the story? And I think given kind of making those stories central to the work, to the writing, I think has been really important. So a lot of folks have said, I really appreciate how you tell the realities of everyday life. But I also tell people how in those moments the activists tell me that I can leave, and I say leave and go back to where, right? That I would somehow be safer in the United States. That there's a moment if you really embrace what it means to kind of to work in solidarity for communities, Black communities, here, there, and everywhere, it means that in that moment, if you're not safe in Salvador, it means I'm not safe in Newark. And if you're unsafe in Newark, you need to be concerned about what's going on with Black communities in places like Salvador. So I think, for me, the really kind of living and embodying kind of collective racial subjection and collective kind of racial kind of Black precarity on an everyday basis allowed me, and kind of living it. I didn't announce in spaces that, I was American. I didn't bust out my passport and deserve that I be treated differently. If you treated a Black person a particular way, I was treated the same as my brother and my sister, right? So I think that's important in terms of thinking about solidarity. And also dealing with, outside of the research, outside of what you're documented for a dissertation or a book, is just the reality of everyday life, dealing with the stillbirths, right? Dealing with, a child dying, dealing with the fact that your comrade is dealing with domestic violence. So those kind of everyday things that you have to deal with, that's not necessarily what you're documenting, right? But also is an important part of how the activism is shaped, but it's also an important part of the story that you're going to tell about these women, right? So I would like to kind of take from both Professor White and Professor Spencer about there's a certain kind of redundancy where you see what you're living in the United States as seemingly kind of present in a place like Brazil, but also how these lives are not always about, these are these active, strong Black women that have overcome everything but that also they're living very precarious lives that they have to grapple with in their homes, on their employment, what it means to lose a child, what does it mean to lose, 2 or 3 children that were never born, right? So, but also what it means to kind of the everyday presence of the state while, struggling for housing and land rights, right? I think there's a way that folks kind of read the book and they kind of hold it, but they don't understand it's like, what you have to kind of live. I always tell people that I don't tell my mother exactly how I do research or the circumstances that I've had to face in order to get the work done, but also if you're serious about solidarity, right? I mean, if you're serious about solidarity, you don't get up and walk away from the people you care about. So I think these are things that I think are oftentimes kind of surround the work, and also how you write the work. I've been very committed to writing in a way that's, I don't know if I know how to write any other way, but in a way that's very accessible. Also, I've been committed to translating my work and make it accessible to women who only write and speak in Portuguese. So I think there's a way that I hope and pray that my work will not only be read by folks in the academy, that will be read by activists and what I call, these scholar activists working outside of academia.
I think in terms of one of the things that I was thinking about when Dr. Perry was talking was some of the kinds of things that I learned about how we look at those numbers of Black crime. One of the things that I learned in this project was the ways in which young girls and women are incarcerated, and their numbers were always higher than native-born white women and immigrant women. one of the things that I found in doing this was that the difference between probation officers who were willing to go into Black communities and those who weren't. So many Black women in the time period that I'm looking at, in the early 1900s, 19-teens, they were eligible for probation, which means that they could go back to their families and be supervised by a probation officer. What I found in the records, in the mainstream records as well as Black records, was that there were only white probation officers who were women, and they were afraid of going into Black communities. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the women who have been arrested are let go? No, that means that those women actually go to prison, which means that the numbers look higher for Black women who are incarcerated because you don't have probation officers who are willing to go into those communities. And so one of the larger goals of the National Urban League during this period was to actually train social workers, Black social workers, who could be probation officers, because they knew that those numbers were skewed. They knew that there's a way in which that Black women who were being incarcerated should have been given that chance for probation, and they weren't. And so I think there are ways in which, when I look at that work at the turn of the 20th century and I look at what's happening today, sometimes it looks like I'm writing, you know, I'm looking at my book from 1900 to the 19-teens. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind that history. We have to know that history to know that there are other, that we have to kind of continually fight against these ideas around Black crime, and particularly Black women and Black girls who are being incarcerated, and we don't hear as much about their plight, in part because of sometimes community issues, but also because of the discrimination and racism that they face in the system.
It really is all about process, I think, because you can have a lot of good ideas to write, because I'm looking at this here, aspiring writers want to know what it takes to write a book. Boy, it takes a lot of patience, and it takes an incredible amount of perseverance. I'm going to tell you, it doesn't, you know, smarts is good, it's nice, but perseverance and stick-to-itiveness, which is another way of saying it. The process is such, I mean, first it's a good idea to have an idea and then follow it up, but then it's just you have to be so dedicated to it. And life, you know, happens. Gosh, does life happen. And people are born, and people die, and you fall in love, and you fall out of love, and your children, as you say, you know, there's tragedy, there's triumph, but through it all, it's really important that you find time every single day to take a little bit of time to write, to work. Unless you get 2 or 3 sentences on a page, you have not worked. I don't care what you've done. You could have taught a class, you could have picked up your kid from school, you could have done the laundry, but unless you get some pages written, it really is, I always assign this book called Bird by Bird. So it really, and what the whole idea is, she has a son, and he waits till the very last minute to do his paper on birds. And he says, well, how am I going to finish it? I only got one night. And his father looks at him and says, you're going to do it bird by bird. So, you know, it really is. And if you think about it, if you write, say you can write a page a day, then you can write a chapter in a month. You know, you have to just stick to it. You almost, I mean, my work actually became my refuge. So whenever anything was happening to me, I mean, some people have all kinds. Some people exercise to death. Some people eat to death. Some people drink to death. I just work. I just, I was able to just zone out everything that was happening in my life for a certain number of hours. And then I did that work, and then I'd come back and join the regular universe. But there is a process. And the other thing that I would say, just in terms of answering this question of process, words don't jump out on the page in beautiful language. They just don't. You need to write what, again, the author I was talking about, you need to write the shitty first draft. You really just need to sit down and put something on the page. Then the next day you go back and you revise it. And then you go back and you revise it. I mean, you don't keep going back to the same, you'll have a great paragraph. But once you establish your own process, people like Toni Morrison, who speaks a lot about this. Everybody needs an editor, and you need to write and just put something down and then edit it, and then edit it, and then edit it, and then edit it. But if you really think that you're just going to sit down and this beautiful prose is going to flow, and it's just going to sit on the page, nah. You have got to be able to look at it and critique it yourself and say, yeah, that's a shitty first draft, but what can I do to make it better? But you've got to be able to do that. You also have to be able to let other people read what it is. You love it so much and you're afraid to let anybody see it, but at the same time you have to be able to take criticism and have to let kind people read your material.
Not too nice, though. You want the real.
Join it
No,
in Dr. Spencer.
that's all I wanted to add. You actually want people who are going to not sometimes be nice, right? And let you know that this is not working, and it's pretty bad. But when I looked at that question...
You can say it in a nice way.
Well, you know.
It's really nice.
This is really nice, but... When I saw the question about process and, aspiring writers might want to know, what did you have to do? I thought of our dear friend Wanda Hendricks, another senior Black women historian, and I was in South Carolina trying to work on the book. And she would always say, well, what you need to do is put that butt in the chair and write, no matter what, no matter what's going on. Kids having a pillow fight, cat walking across the desk, whatever is happening, you actually just have to do it every day, zone out and work. And emotionally, because of all that we have heard about how we engage with our subjects, it can be taxing. It can be taxing. Channeling those stories can be definitely emotionally draining, but it's something you have to do every day. And every time I started to, I don't know if I can do it anymore, it was like, well, they didn't have a choice about whether or not they could sort of fight their fights anymore, so move the cat, pretend you don't hear the kids, and write.
Fair enough. I need to get more discipline then. I want to ask a question that moves us in a slightly different direction and ask Dr. Spencer if you would pick up on this. So I read Telling Histories, which Dr. White, you wrote that book, or you put it together. She is my shero. And I read the book. I think I was like 19. I was a second-year college student, and I thought, I want to be like these women. Like, I want to do what they do. I'm not sure that I'm as smart as they are, but maybe I can get there. And so, that was what convinced me, right? Gave me the conviction that I should take every step to achieve, receiving a PhD or doing doctoral work, writing Black history. And so, for this question, I'm wondering, what inspired you all? I'm sure we're all wondering that, right? Like, they've all done phenomenal things. What convinced you to do that? What's your conviction?
Okay, and a plug for Telling Histories, an amazing book. I read it and I was so humbled by the challenges that my foremothers had gone through, sometimes you feel so overwhelmed by your challenges that it's hard to imagine the challenges of the past, the choice of research topic, the advisors advising you about when to plan your family, all the things that people had to go through. I mean, illness and dealing with your institution's response to, after working you near death, when you do fall ill, the way they oftentimes do everything in their power to not support you. So it's a very powerful book. I was very humbled by reading it. I feel like I'm inspired by oftentimes people in history. Like I keep sort of people's stories in my heart. And I want to bring those people and introduce them to the world in some ways. Stories of people who I believe shifted the power balance, who put things in brilliant ways with their oratory, who were bold enough and brave enough to truly speak truth to power. I get inspired by those people. And also by the feeling oftentimes that the things that I'm doing in my world today, that historians are going to have to hunt to prove were existing at this time. Right? Sometimes you feel like the way you're operating through the way you're moving through the world is so different from perhaps the mainstream that it's very easy for people to erase you as you're happening, as you're moving through the world. Like for example, if you're involved, now, if you're involved in an anti-war organization, and then later on you can imagine that some scholar is going to have to prove that Black people in 2017 cared about the war and what was going on in the world and weren't just focused on, Beyonce, etc. And so understanding that almost that as you're in motion, you're being erased. Right, it gives you that motivation to go back and find that history for yourself, of yourself, and to bring that to a larger audience. So there are people, like I said, that motivate me. One person in particular, General Baker, he was one of the key elements of a radical activist who started the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And, the other thing to point out, I think, about General Baker and his story is that there are many people like him. Because I work on the 60s, I oftentimes have the opportunity to interview people. And oftentimes, these amazing people who did all of these things in history are amongst us forgotten. Right? I have visited people in their nursing homes. Right? I don't have any illusion that if some of the greats were around today, they may not be forgotten. Right, the people that we hold up, the Rosa Parks and the Ella Bakers and the Malcolm X's, many of those people die alone, impoverished, and forgotten. So it's very important for me to kind of tell that story of that generation who have more yesterdays than tomorrows before they're not here anymore. Right? And I feel like that is my motivation. There's a time ticking on that. And that pushes me to keep going when I feel like I'm overwhelmed by other things, because I know there have been many times where I find someone, I'm Googling them, I find their Facebook page, and then I find that, wow, they passed away, 2 years ago, 1 year ago. And when I look for them in the historical record, they're just not there. They're just not there. So we're losing people. And when people pass away, oftentimes their history and their legacy goes with them. That is not the case for General Baker. There's a General Baker History Institute that's forming to tell the story of his legacy as a radical activist in Detroit. But there are many General Bakers. And that's what motivates me, is to sort of keep that in mind, that, this is for, the elders, in a way. And oftentimes, the people that are just ordinary people in our communities have amazing stories. They played amazing roles in history. And recovering that through oral history is just something I'm passionate about.
And what I found, even in the Brazilian example, was that I felt as though that Black struggles or Black politics were only understood in terms of these major organizations, these kind of maybe six figures or these major folks that had kind of graced the pages of these books that had been cited, but that the everyday Black woman, that no one knew their names, would never be remembered. And I kind of saw that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write their names down. And I didn't want to follow as an anthropologist and say, well, I can't write their name, it has to be a pseudonym. I have to tell the story in a particular kind of way, change the name, the name of their neighborhood, almost kind of in a fictitious kind of create a story around these folks. But I wanted them to be written down and be part of the written record, that I wanted them to be remembered as part of a political moment, right? That they fought to change the city of Salvador. They fought to be incorporated in decisions about how the city was going to be developed, that there were women that were concerned about, what was going to happen, with the city. Right, that they owned the city, they wanted to belong, they changed land laws, so there's a way that Black women, I agree, get kind of written out of those discourses, especially in Brazil where they say, well, Black people are only, concerned with, aesthetics, such as hair, using African clothing, or perhaps some recognition that they're leading for religious communities, but certainly they're not participating in terms of political debates or changing public policy, and that's what I was I'm concerned about. I want to give credit to a professor who's Kim Hall, who's a professor at Barnard College. She was my professor in undergrad at Georgetown. She taught Intro to Women's Studies, introduced me to theorists like Bell Hooks, to great scholars like Deborah White. And it's reading those works that she actually introduced the idea of going into academia. I was 100% certain I was going to become a lawyer or a career diplomat. And I studied languages and I traveled. And she said, have you ever thought about doing a PhD? And I just really had no clue what it took to get a PhD or to become an academic or what that life was like. And she said, what do you care about? And I said, I've traveled around Latin America and the Caribbean, and I think that people need to learn that part of the story as part of a broader diasporic experience. So I started to, she introduced me to other women who had traveled and even traveled and written, the Catherine Dunhams, the Zora Neale Hurstons, the Sheila Walkers, these various Black women who had traveled and documented the stories of Black women around the world. So I think that I credit, I know many of you probably have professors who have impacted you, and I think Kim Hall really changed the course of my my experience. I mean, I think I probably would be a lawyer right now. I mean, I'm certain that I would, or a career diplomat. I'd studied Spanish and Portuguese with that intention, that I'd probably go into the Foreign Service or something of the sort, I'm not sure. So I think that in many ways, that she inspired me, and also reading the autobiographies of Black women. I remember one summer I just read all of them. If I can just be half as brave, half as courageous. I mean, these are women who are standing in front of bulldozers. These are women who are burning tires in the middle of the highway and blocking traffic and facing the police. Donaira C, she died defending her grandson, right? And from a heart attack, right? Even though we know how that works, but but these are women who put their lives on the line, and I feel just a sense of responsibility. I'm deeply and profoundly inspired by their political work, that I need to tell their stories, that people need to know about them, that cities don't contemplate poor communities by happenstance, right? If you look at a city like Salvador, these coastal communities remain because people fought to stay. If it were up to the state, they would have been demolished. When I lived in North, there were many more high-rises. I don't know if you guys remember, right? But people, so I think, understanding how people fight to remain in cities, I think is really important. And the activists themselves, I think, inspired me to continue to do this work.
Thank you. Dr. White, I want to switch just a little bit more and ask, so this is our last question. What do you think Black history offers to the way that we understand American history and world history? Oh, wrong question. So the question is, what kinds of resources do you think are necessary to continue telling the types of histories that you guys tell? What do we need to make more available so that people can continue to research and write Black history?
Well, I think the first thing you need is an awareness of ordinary teachers from in the K through 12 system to know that Black history matters and they need to know Black history. I was introduced to history via my high school history teacher who saw that I liked history, and whenever we had assignments, I just did over and above. So she handed me a couple of books, and the books happened to be on the Civil War and Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the first time when I was in high school I realized, oh, so Lincoln didn't really free any slaves. It was like, that was such an eye-opener. And she just kept giving me more books and giving me more books, and I just kept reading them and reading them and reading them. So it was a high school, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a high school teacher because I wanted to be like Miss Rothman, who just kept feeding me stuff, and I just kept eating it, you know. It turns out that when I graduated from school, I didn't have any. There were no schools. There were no schools. There were no teaching jobs open at the high school level. I was born and raised in New York City, and so I was a teacher in the New York City school system for a while, and I taught fifth grade. I taught fifth grade because there weren't any high school teachers. There weren't any high school jobs. So very quickly, I started in September. By November, I had all my applications in for graduate school because I really wanted to engage in history. I just, because social studies was okay, but then I had to teach all the other subjects as well. And to be perfectly honest, the reason that I really became a historian had to do with the fact that I wanted more free time in my life. I have none now. I mean, this is like, you have flex time, but you have no time. But I just really did. I wanted to be able, I wanted to be able to control my own time. And I said, what a great job. I can have children, I can do all of this. It's a different way of living because you are working 25 hours a day on this stuff, but that's really what was my principal motivation, to be perfectly honest. I'd like to be able to tell people, well, I was inspired by the people and, and what I could do for my people, etc. And quite frankly, it was mostly what I could do for myself. Nobody in my family, I mean, not only was I born and raised in New York City, but my family was sharecroppers. And I grew up in the projects in Manhattan. So it's not like, and I say that because I think it's important for people who are in the room and people who are going to school now, no matter how hard you struggle, you can make it. You can do it. If again, and I say, shit's gonna happen in your life, and you just have to just put it aside and just focus. And it does take a little luck, but basically my parents moved to New York City to get away from the South, and one became a short order cook. My mother was a domestic worker. And it was just that they didn't take no for an answer, like you won't or you can't. It was like you will, and that was just it. So I wanted to answer that question because I do think it's important, because there's a way that people look at us sitting up here, and so you have a PhD, but we didn't always. And we really did have to struggle. But back to the question that you asked me, I really think that it is imperative that Black history be integrated into the curriculum from K through
Pre-K.
12.
Pre-K.
Pre-K. No, you're right. Pre-K. You're absolutely right. Because it's at that very early stage that children start to get a sense of who they are, et cetera. So and that will inspire them. That means that we have to train our teachers better.
Yes.
Okay, we just have to. I do a lot of teacher training stuff, so I'm quite aware of all that's necessary. And then just finally, I think that when you study American history, if you study American history without African American history, you can't understand American history. But this notion that that America has this great constitution with all of these amendments, that it is always striving towards equality, etc. I mean, these things, first, I mean, that you can tell that story if you want, but I'll tell you who was striving for equality and who kept pushing that envelope and who insisted that things change. Right? I mean, that is how you understand. You can't have American freedom unless you know the African American story.
Right.
Hi, I'm sorry. Hi, how are you? My name is Dan Kurtz, I'm a Rutgers grad. My question to you is a question that really arose to me when I first started working with the Social Security Administration in Newark. I worked for Social Security for a while. And that is the coming of automation for almost all manual labor jobs. I mean, of course, there'll always be some manual labor jobs, but I'm talking about, like, a wipeout, 70, 80% of all driving jobs, taxi jobs, even many caregiving jobs. Considering that African American women in the African American community frequently, unfairly, depend on a lot of these jobs, do you see a reason for concern? Do you see that this might be, without some kind of national minimum income or some kind of hallmark situation, that this is that this kind of unraveling societally is going to happen in 2 decades? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I just would like to point out is that Black women have always, have been in a very vulnerable place with regard to labor. So it's hard, unfortunately, I wish that we could sort of say that there was some new phase or trend with regard to how Black women were positioned as laborers. But the vulnerability is as old as Black in America. So I just think that with every new trend, you see that vulnerability kind of taking shape in different ways. And so the bigger question, or the question I think that I would point, folks to, is what kind of systems and structures and ideas and beliefs do we have to nurture and cultivate in order to perpetuate generations of, a special type of, vulnerable laborer within, the American sort of economic structure. So those would be the questions. And I did spend the 15 years in the classroom, and that was one of the things that I always wanted my history students, on the secondary level to really understand, is that these vulnerabilities don't just sort of pop up in the face of, the development of new technologies. They're deeply ingrained in the way that we even understand the value of human beings and life, and how we stratify them in this society. Thank you.
I would just add to that, and I think that vulnerability is hitting everyone in the society.
Right.
And certainly, Black people have been called the miner's canary. All right, so when the canary dies, the miner needs to get out of the mine. And whatever seems to happen to Black people, it's coming to everyone else. I mean, we only need to look at the drug epidemic. You couldn't run from that. And I do see a convergence with not just black women, but I certainly see like, I think white women's lives are also endangered, and there's a convergence in the sense that they are as vulnerable as black women and becoming as vulnerable, which is one of the reasons that they're holding on to their white supremacy as hard as they possibly can. So when you look and see who voted for Trump and why they voted for Trump, a lot of it has to do with, oh my God, you know, when you look at marriage rates, they are low for white women. When you look at unemployment, that is high for white women. In essence, they are recapitulating this life that black women have always had to deal with, and they're holding on to whatever they can to stave off that from happening. Okay, so it's not just a matter of African American women who face vulnerability. The same thing you could say for white men, because they see, when black men were faced unemployment, or when they were laid off because of automation, or when they were the last hired and the first fired, everyone said it was some sort of cultural disability that they had, some sort of pathology. Now the same exact thing is happening to white men, and okay, now we have a president who is trying, who's trying to, who does this white nationalist thing, which says that, it's about something else. It's not about you. It's not about the economy. It's about all those immigrants and all those other people who are taking your jobs. So, I mean, this is not just about vulnerability for black women. It's just like the rest of society is coming right along with us. And, well, I could go on. But
Another question.
I know you talk about black women being vulnerable, but talk about or research the women who are in the system. Now, to be honest, I am working with African American women chemists, and I wrote one book, and the second one is out, and some of the women who are now out are on television talking about what they're doing. So is anybody else talking about African American women who are leaders in their profession?
I mean, a portion of my book talks about women who were leaders during the time period I'm looking at. So, I mean, they were institution builders, and they were very much engaged in the problems within black communities, but they were specifically concerned about black women because they knew that that if they didn't say something, that the larger organizations were not necessarily going to deal with the plight of black women in the criminal justice system. So in terms of institution building to prevent women from entering the system, there are women like Victoria Earl Matthews, who opened a home in New York in 1897 called the White Rose Home. But there was also Grace Campbell, who was a black socialist, who worked with a nationalist group called the African Blood Brotherhood. But she was right in that system as a social worker, a probation officer, a parole officer, and she opened a home for black women who could not, because of segregation, go into other homes to make sure that they were cared for before they had to go to court. So there are black women across the board and across history, and I'm very glad that you were doing that work now, but that is a part of a long, long, long legacy.
And if I could add, it used to be that the only people we talked about were the people who were the leaders. For the very longest time, and I mean, some of that history had to be written. I have a book called Too Heavy a Load: Black Women in Defense of Themselves. And that has nothing to do, it's all about black women who were leaders, who did the kinds of things that you're doing.
It's really important, though, that we try to get at the voices of people who don't generally have a voice.
Right.
So that's the reason maybe that we seem to be talking about that, because I think it is important that everybody, you don't have to be an Ella Baker to have your history out there. And you don't necessarily need to be, somebody who wins all kinds of awards. But you ordinary black women, we want their lives, people like my aunts, my mother, who will remain nameless unless somebody says their name.
I just want to add with the Ella Baker component, I think we have to remember change over time. When I was an undergraduate in the early 90s, I was in a Black Women's History course, and I would see her name, and I would see her name in civil rights books, but I didn't know anything about her. Every major civil rights organization in the 20th century, her name was there, along with Dr. King, along with all of the men that we normally think about. And that writing hadn't been done at the time that, like Barbara Ransby's book and all of the books that came much later. And it was because I knew she was important, but the information wasn't there. That's the reason why I became a historian. And now more people know who she is, but it's been 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that really wasn't the case. Her name was in a list, and now we have a book, and now we have more, articles, and people really know about her. But I think it is the fact that that people started asking different kinds of questions, like what did Black women do in the civil rights movement? What role did they play? And so the kinds of questions that folks like us are asking raise different kinds of answers. And I can't also explain how important it was for me, someone who I think Dr. Perry and I both said that we wanted to be lawyers. I can't explain to you how important it was for one of my professors to actually say, I think you should go to graduate school. And I was looking at him like, I told you I wanted to go to law school. Like, what is the issue? But I think the thing is that I looked at him so blankly because I had never imagined myself getting a PhD or becoming a history professor. And when he actually helped me think about that, and then I actually saw Black women with PhDs doing the history of Black women, that made all the difference in the world, because it wasn't just someone who said, you should actually think about doing this. He was actually seeing Black women actually doing it that actually pushed me to think that I could possibly do it myself. And so I think that imagining that you can actually do it is a step, but also seeing the examples. Dr. White is one of them, but when I was an undergraduate, Ella Baker was not on the lips of everybody the way she is now, and there weren't as many Black women doing this kind of work during that period either.
Okay, I'm gonna try to, I'm so sorry, we have 3 questions, we can try and get them in. All right, I'm sorry for folks who will not be able to get their question asked.
Thank you, good evening. I have a rather short question. How do you define Blackness and by extension, minority status in light of corrective historical analysis?
Deep plunge.
He has been doing his homework. Interesting. One of the things that I uncovered in my last research project, and I hope this sort of addresses where you're going, I really had to grapple with the idea of Black authenticity. What is Black? And how do we understand it? Because one of the things I kept coming up against in the archive was white people saying what Black culture was, white people describing what was authentically Black. what was inherent to black people, what you're most likely to find in the black people in the South. And at the same time that I'm looking in other places and finding in the pop culture and among black intelligentsia, the Harlem Renaissance, right? I'm finding them also talking about a sort of black authenticity. And there was all of this sort of fighting going on around who are and what are black people. And one of the things I think is really groundbreaking about Alan Locke's essay on the New Negro is that he really starts to tear apart some of the fictions, right? That the old Negro is a fiction, and the new Negro is defined by this forward progressive push for education, for political autonomy, you know, shifting geography and migrating, right? So what becomes a conversation about black people, at least as I saw it in his essay, is largely about this fight, this struggle, especially in the Americas, with white supremacy. So I think that I would refrain from attempting to answer your question, because I think that the question is just a perfect example of what America cultures, what it naturally grows, which is this preoccupation with what is this category, but this category has no, you know, meaning in it of itself outside of these conditions, right? So that's sort of where I think the historical analysis is taking us. If we look closely and we see black people and white people, everyone was sort of invested in this project of talking about what is blackness. I'm even kind of entertained, and hopefully I won't make anybody mad. I'm even entertained by, you know, the new sort of incarnations of this conversation among the young, hip millennials, you know, Afro-pessimism, Afro-futurism. These are, we're still having the same, who are we, what are our policies? We're having the same conversations, generation after generation after generation. And that's not to make it small. It's important, right? It's powerful, it's meaningful.
Right.
So.
Dr. Perry?
I think this question, I feel as though I get some variation of this question all the time, because I work on, I've done work throughout the Americas where, in communities where they're not generally perceived as black, right? Luisa Barrios, who was the former minister of racial equality in Brazil, and she recently passed away. She actually went to study on the roots in Hamilton through the Afro-Latin Project, an African diasporic project that she started in Michigan State, which is really important to note that. But one of the things she said is that, you know, every time black folks start to make particular demands on citizenship and say, we want access to education, we want access to clean running water, health care, et cetera, people say, well, who are the black people we're going to distribute these resources to? And she said, you know, I want you to go and ask the police officers who the black folks are. Right? If you ask the police officers who the black folks are, they can tell you who would be deserving of affirmative action, for example. Right? So I think the question, and folks like even Salas Augusto, he said, even in the context of Brazil, right, that has approximately 200 million people, even if we go according to census data that says 51-52% are black, you know, do the math. There's over 100 million of that population is black, right? That's self-identified black. That's not counting the people that look like me, who still may say that they are, you know, café con leche or some other combination, or Cabo or some other thing, you know. But they're not. So that doesn't count those particular groups of folks. But he says that even if there are only 100 million black people, I want 100 million black people to have rights, right? So I think that the question of even like who's black, as we're documenting this, I think matters to a certain degree. But he said, if you just ask the police and police officers, we'll answer that question for you about what blackness means. But what he's hinting at is what anti-blackness means, and what white supremacy means in these societies. And the research shows in Brazil that black and brown people, the people who self-identify as brown, actually have the same life conditions independent of how they self-identify. So people who self-identify as pardo, moreno, whatever, they actually is just as likely to be killed by the police. They're just as likely to live in poor neighborhoods. So anti-blackness is still at play, regardless of how these categories break up. So it's not to say that they're not important, but it suggests that look at life conditions and you'll realize that these categories, that white supremacy is really what we need to be looking at, not necessarily how folks identified.
Okay, that's fine. Next question, and then we have just one more, so don't lose your thought.
Hi, you just mentioned forgotten heroes, and many of you are historians, so I just wanted to know how you can go about finding the forgotten heroes and kind of unlocking their true history, since we're oftentimes not exposed to it at school.
You know, sometimes you stumble on these, they're forgotten for a reason. And it is often the case that while you're doing historical research, you stumble on somebody. So, for example, one of our graduate students who wrote the history of this, what's her name, Reese Taylor?
Yeah.
Okay, Danielle McGuire, right. So, you know, actually when I was doing research on Too Heavy a Load, which is like 20 years ago, I was in the paper, I was in the same newspapers, and I kept seeing this Reese Taylor news, the case, and it turns out that Rosa Parks has a special connection to Reese Taylor, as a woman who was raped and who took her case through the court system, but she was also somebody who was a forgotten hero in many ways. So I just think, it's like as historians, I think we stumble upon them often. It's not like we know about them and then, I mean, sometimes you can say, well, I really do know, and then you go and look for them, but quite frequently these people come up in the process of, sometimes you're looking this way and something will come up over here, and that's sort of the way it happens.
I wanted to say that sometimes I have found that through looking at primary sources, it's where the inspiration comes from or where you encounter people. So I wrote my master's essay on the Mississippi flood of 1927 because I saw a picture of a sharecropper with a tag on them, almost like if they were a piece of cattle, and it struck me and I was like, well, what is this? And then the detective work followed. I learned about General Baker in an undergraduate class when I was reading a collection of essays and I saw a letter that he wrote, and it stayed with me. So how do we encounter primary sources? To what extent do we delve into these first-hand accounts, and in conjunction with reading the synthetic accounts by professional historians, but how do we sort of move beyond that into empowering ourselves to dig into the past? Especially now when you can go on the internet and you can be in document collections, you can see Jet and Ebony magazines from the past. I mean, primary sources are out there at your fingertips. And I think it's through that browsing, through following your interests, through digging deeper when you see a name, and using all of the tools that are available to you, that you can really, by sparking your curiosity, you can become you can become an architect of the past, right? You can become someone who's writing history. And I think it's important to note that while we are professional historians, there are also so many different ways to preserve and tell and share history, whether it be through genealogy, family history, whether it be through projects. There's so many different ways to tell history and to recapture the stories of individuals, of organizations, etc. So following your curiosity, I think, is one of these. I find that today our curiosity gets channeled towards technologies that are meant to distract. And sometimes I want to be distracted too. Right, but let's think about it. The amount of time you may spend playing a game on your phone, or watching that thing, or the binge watching, all of that, all the things I do as well. But I'm just saying that if you can recover some of that time for your own intellectual curiosity, your life will be enriched.
Right.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I would just like to thank all of you guys for being here tonight, because just in the past 2 hours, I feel like I've just learned and gained so much with this. So I just really appreciate it. My question is, what is the most influential fact or experience that will stick with you throughout your journey as historians and authors?
Since my journey has been a little longer. Very seriously, when Aren't I a Woman, you know, and in the book, Telling Histories, I tell the story of how that book almost didn't get published and almost was put in the trash heap. And somebody told me that I should write a biography of the book because from the beginning to the end, nobody wanted that book out. And at the time, I couldn't see why. I did the homework, I worked in the archives, I did every single thing the way it was supposed to be done. I went to the archives, I sat there forever and ever. Yeah, I encountered the fact that enslaved women, black women, do not leave sources. How do I write it? I had white male professors who just kept telling me, you know, you're never going to get a PhD. This is garbage. My dissertation was, you know, I handed it in 3 weeks before I was supposed to defend it. It got rejected. I had to go back to the drawing board. I had to rewrite it and rewrite it again and again. I could not get anybody to publish it. And I just kept getting all of these negative answers. No, this is, you know, where's the audience for this book? Nobody's going to read this book. You haven't done enough work. You know, why do we need another book on slavery? And what I did not understand was that was gatekeeping. I didn't. I thought, I am a lousy historian. People aren't going to read this book. And I can't tell you how I cried and how much anguish there was about it. But, you know, looking back on it, the thing that will stay with me is that there's a lot of gatekeeping in academia. And particularly if I was one of the very first African Americans, not just African American women, but African Americans to go into the academy and to be a professional historian. And it was clear that we were not wanted. We just weren't wanted. African American history was not wanted. But I didn't see that. I couldn't see that. And it was only my doggedness and perseverance that, you know, I was just like, well, I don't really have another book to write. So I can't tell you how many times I was told to scrap it and do something else. And the other thing that sticks with me is that the person, I kept saying, okay, I was wrong, I was wrong, I was wrong, I was wrong, until all of a sudden I was right. I'm telling you, like, how is it that overnight I'm right? Because a white woman, bless her soul, named Anne Ferris Scott, rescued the book, and she said, Anne Ferris Scott wrote the book, The Southern Lady. She's known as the mother of women's history. She and another white woman named Gerda Lerner. And she was doing a review article, and she happened to see my dissertation, and she read it. And she said, this is the best thing that's ever been written. Okay, so yeah, a white woman had to go and tell everybody that, okay, this is the best thing that's ever been. She said, you know, if you don't have a publisher, I'll take your book to Norton, to W.W. Norton, Fifth Avenue Publishing Firm. So like overnight, the book has a contract. But I was wrong. Remember, I was wrong for 6 whole years. I got this contract right on the eve of, you know, coming up for tenure. So the other thing that really is important is having a mentor. You can't get through this alone. You know, I did. I had nobody to tell me, you know, how to do this. I sort of just did it by trial and error. So mentorship is exceedingly important. But also,
just understand that academia is just like corporate America. There is politics and politics and politics on top of politics. And so you have got to, there's no meritocracy out there. There's just so much of the same stuff that is in the workplace, every single place, every other place. Those are the two things. And you do need help. And if you can't, if nobody volunteers, go looking for it.
Okay, so there is a dance revolution happening above us.
Oh my gosh, what is that? I'm like,
And I feel like they are trying to tell us to go away. I don't like it.
Can I just,
Yes.
I just want to thank Dr. White for coming to participate on our panel. We are all very, I think, grateful that she would have this conversation with us. And I will say, as a Rutgers New Brunswick PhD graduate student at one time, that of all of the wonderful mentors that I've had, and I've had many, Carol Satter, Mia Bay, great people, making sure that I learned everything that I needed to learn. Dr. White certainly made sure I learned some more, and she also made sure I did not suffer through graduate school. So everything that she had sort of experienced, for so many of us, she made sure that that was not ours.
Everyone, we are going to end our program here, but before we go, I'd just like to thank the Federated Department of History here at Rutgers Newark, the Department of African American and African Studies, the Program in Women's and Gender Studies, and the Clem Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience, and although I don't see her, Christina Strasburger. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good evening.